In Screencast 2, we're going to talk about a definition, or not really a definition, but an understanding of what sport economics is about. So a bit more of an insight into the themes, the issues that we will be looking at during this module. This, of course, can be supplemented by reading the workbook for this week, and I've already outlined to you in that some of the areas that we'll talk about in this screencast. And after we've talked about what sport economics is about, I want to talk to you about the global economics aspect of this module. So I just want to very briefly trace the development of the global sports market. So from the period before the 1960s, so the middle of the 20th century, through to the early 20th century. You will look at this in more detail later in the module, but just to help you understand the context of the module and some of the things that we will be talking about, particularly in the second half of the module for the global aspects, it's worth mentioning these early on. So let's just think again about this lens analogy. So it's a kind of way of seeing. So when we look through the economics lens, we're understanding or looking for certain patterns and certain issues. So it helps us understand the phenomena of sport. You know, what is sport? What are its characteristics? How does it behave economically? What are the economics of sport, and how can this help us understand the way that the market is involved and the way that actors in that market behave as well? So, sport economics can be used to explain determinants for the demand of sport. And in the workbook, I've asked you to think about why is that important for managers. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I'm going to ask you, or most of these bullet points actually, I've asked you to think about these in the workbook and reflect on why it's important for a manager to understand these issues and to have some insight into them. But anyway, we'll look at the determinants of the demand for sport. So how does income, price, availability of time, changing tastes and preferences, how do they actually affect the demand for sport? And are all sports created and traded in a marketplace? We'll look at something called household production theory, and that's where people can decide to create their own leisure activities including sport, which might not involve the kind of purchase of goods and services such as equipment or memberships of gyms. They can actually create their own kind of leisure time activity in sport. So we'll look at that because that has got implications depending on the economic cycle and the amount of disposable income which is available to individuals. Okay. We'll also look at the determinants for the supply of sport. So how can we understand trends in the industry? How can we understand changing consumer tastes and preferences, and how does that help us understand the supply of sport? And also, we're also looking at supply objectives of different organisations within the sport industry, because a commercial provider such as Nike or a commercial provider such as Pure Gyms in the UK is not providing its goods and services for exactly the same reasons as a public sector, local authority, city council gym is providing its services. The objectives are different, and therefore the rationale and the economics are different. So in the commercial sector, it's really about profit and other outcomes, which may involve better health and improved quality of life. They are secondary. The primary objective is to make a profit. In the public sector, typically what we've seen is that there is not a profit motive, and that often services are supplied at a subsidised level, i.e. the services actually make a loss. So for those of you who've been in Sheffield over the last few weeks and are aware of Ponds Forge, the major sports facility, the international sports facility in the middle of Sheffield, you'll see that that's been closed. And one of the reasons it's closed is that that has very high costs and doesn't generate enough income to cover its costs, i.e. the City Council subsidises its operation to the tune of well over £1 million per year. And the reason it's been kept closed in the current coronavirus situation is that with social distancing measures in place, the throughput, the number of visitors that are able to use the facility means that income is going to be lower than ever. But staff still have to be paid. There are fixed costs there, which means that the costs of operating that facility are still quite high. So we're looking at a subsidised facility there, and that has been the pattern in the public sector in the UK and across most nations for many years. Not all countries have a subsidised sports service in the public or government sector, but most countries do, and we'll talk about that later in the module. And this brings on to the next point, which is how will my governments engage in the sport industry? Well, we will talk about and use economic language about public goods. And a public good is something which provides benefits above and beyond the individual. So if you are active in sport, you don't just get personal benefits, there is a public benefit to that, in that you are less likely to use the health service, you are less likely to take days off ill, you are more likely to be a productive citizen. So that is one reason why governments engage in the sport industry, to try to promote the benefits, partially from an altruistic point of view, because of the benefits to individual citizens, but also because of wider societal benefits. So we will look at arguments around merit goods, public goods, and the rationale for government involvement around that. So in the public sector, there's a particular language around the nature of goods and the benefits that flow from them. So we'll explore that in more detail as the module goes on. And we can also look at things like how sport events impact upon their host nation. So, you know, the reason this is on a smaller scale, so this is not a mega event like the Olympics or FIFA, but the reason I'm involved in the sport industry is that I was a student in Sheffield in the mid-1980s doing a history degree, and not particularly motivated to do it, but interested in sport, and I knew I didn't want to be a PE teacher. Sheffield, at the time in the mid-1980s, was going through a major industrial restructuring, which was very painful as the steel industry declined in the city. So Sheffield historically has been a heavy engineering steel city. So on some figures, 90,000 jobs went in the steel industry in Sheffield and in related industries in the mid-1980s. So Sheffield was struggling and looking for its future and what it could do. So the City Council in Sheffield at that time bid to host the 1991 World Student Games. And part of the rationale for that was investment back in the Lower Don Valley, where the steelworks were, which at that time was the largest space of derelict industrial land in Western Europe. So it was to kind of improve the physical infrastructure of that area, to try to generate new jobs in the leisure industries at this time, and to attract inward investment from the government to improve facilities, but also from visitors to events. So we can look at that, and we'll talk about how successful different cities have been in achieving economic regeneration and economic impacts in their areas through hosting major events. There's a big debate about that in Sheffield, which still goes on to this day, 30 years after the event was held. So these things still have a lot of currency in cities like Sheffield. So we will explore that, and you will look about economic impacts, multipliers, the ripple effect, and the rationale for investment. So again, economic theory applied to examples in the sport industry, which makes it very interesting to study. Okay, so I don't think I'm going to talk to you much about this slide actually, but some of the other things we're going to talk about in this module, the last bullet point on this slide, are demand and supply. So what is the interplay between demand and supply, and does it always work? Elasticity of demand and pricing. Yeah. So how elastic is demand? And elasticity means how much does demand, how flexible is demand, how much will it stretch and accommodate changes in pricing. So if a good or a product is inelastic, demand for it doesn't really change much as prices change. If it's highly elastic, demand will change as prices change. And we've already talked about supply objectives and how governments can influence the industry. So that's given you a flavour. It's always difficult in introductory lectures to give students a complete overview and a complete understanding. Understanding is something that we hope grows and emerges as you study the module and as you go through in hopefully a logical way and complete the tasks and the homework and attend lectures and do the reading. And completing the assessment for the module will also help you improve your understanding of these key concepts. But really that's just to try and give you a flavour of what's coming up. So I said we'd talk about a definition of sport economics and what the module will cover. But I also said that we'd look at the emergence of the global sports economy. So I want to just go through in a few slides and explain some of the key historical developments or the characteristics of the sport economy at different stages in a relatively recent history. Now, I think in the workbook for this week, I mentioned that if you wanted to read more into this, you could read the first two chapters of Grattan et al.'s Global Sports, Economics of Global Sports, to help you understand a bit more. But essentially, and there is a history to the development of the sport industry before the 1960s, but we can start to see things changing in the 1960s. So this is why I wanted to kind of start at this point. There is a history going back into ancient civilization through into the Industrial Revolution. So what was leisure and sport like just before the Industrial Revolution? What happened during the early Industrial Revolution, the later Industrial Revolution, and then as we moved into the 20th century. But in terms of understanding the global sports economy, let's start here, just before the 1960s. So in the 1960s, we didn't have a global sports economy. It was really predominantly a local activity. So what does that mean? That means doing activity locally. It means spectating in sport locally. And we didn't really have a mass media, and certainly we didn't have much broadcasting or live broadcasting of sport before the 1960s. It was relatively rare. So that means that broadcasting rights income for leagues, for events rights holders, so the IOC owned the rights to selling broadcast, have the rights for selling broadcasting rights to various broadcasters across the world. FIFA owned the World Cup rights and they can sell them, and so on and so on. In England, the English FA owns the FA Cup, and so on and so on. So broadcasting rights income was pretty low. Government funding of elite sport was quite low. And we'll talk about why that was a bit later. And if you look at the UK, there are hundreds of millions of pounds spent in each 4-year economic cycle, each 4-year Olympic cycle, on funding for elite sport. So we've come a long way since before the 1960s. when very little money was coming from government to elite sport. And because of the lack of exposure, sponsorship income was pretty negligible. So, for sponsorship to be attracted, you've got to be in the public eye and well seen, and sport just didn't really have that. And also the relationship between business and sport, the commercialisation of sport, was not strong. So the sports market was dominated by mass participation sport, right? So voluntary sector sport, the main supplier, so clubs playing sport, and the buying of equipment, paying of fees for membership, etc., was where a lot of the money came in. So it came in at the kind of lowest level, if you like, of the sports market, down at the bottom, the grassroots, with the everyday players, the normal people playing. Okay, elite sport was mainly amateur, with the exception of professional team sports, and there really weren't many professional team sports. So in the UK, you had football really, and basically that was it. Cricket was still, there was a professional element to it, but there was not much money in the game. Rugby union was an amateur sport. Obviously rugby league was a professional sport. In America you had professional sports leagues, but really, outside of, professional football, a bit of professional cricket in this country, and outside basketball, the NFL, and baseball in America, and football and basketball possibly in other countries, you didn't really have large-scale professionalisation, yeah? And certainly in athletics and Olympic sports, there was a requirement that athletes were amateur and were not paid for what they did. Okay, so elite sport was mainly amateur, and there was no government funding, there was no sponsorship of athletes, and for professional team sports, the rewards were still very modest. It was a fairly ordinarily paid job. So, once we get to the 1960s and 1970s, there are a number of forces which start to change the nature of the global sports economy. And the first of these is the increasing importance of international sporting competitions. So the Olympic movement starts to gain pace. The World Cups for football become more important. And the performance of your country projects a kind of image as to the success, the vitality of your nation. So this meant that national sports policies and strategies began to be looked at for the first time for elite sport. Some of these, it has to be said, kind of policies and strategies in former communist countries, where it was seen as promoting a kind of particular image of the success of communist states. So not least happening in those countries, but also happening in other countries as well. The other thing that happens with the increasing importance in terms of, for elite sports people, and the increasing number of international competitions, is that these become more visible. We now have a mass media. I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but the number of television sets which were owned is increasing, which changes the way that people consume and watch international live sport. So this is becoming increasingly visible. The number of television sets, the growth of TV, the growth of satellite communications to allow these things to be broadcast live, really changes the experience of global sports events, some of which happen on the other side of the world. So for someone in England, the 1970 World Cup in Mexico was kind of, a real experience. Watching the Olympics in Tokyo was a real novel thing. Okay, so you've got those kinds of things developing. At the same time, you've got a fairly international sport for all movement. And this is where governments had always recognised, the kind of utility of sports for promoting certain kinds of valuable behaviour and health. But sport for all really begins to take off in the 1960s and 70s, particularly in the 1970s. And this creates the need for a national policy for mass participation sport. So in the UK and in England and Wales around this time, you've also got the growth of local authority sports. So city councils like Sheffield City Council, for the first time really building large sports centres. So city councils and local councils had always provided small swimming pools, many dating back to the Victorian period, the late 19th century. But in the 1970s, you've got modern sports facilities being built for the first time. And they've not really changed an awful lot in the 40 years since this period. They have changed a little bit, but the basic concept is still there. So, you've got an increase in the supply of sport in the public sector. So the public sector as suppliers of sports becoming important for the first time. And to back up this kind of sport for all, you've got national agencies for sports policy being created. So you have the Sports Council for England founded. There was an advisory sports council dating back to the mid-1960s. But in the 1970s, the Sports Council is created. The Sports Council is an arm's length organisation which acts on behalf of the British government in England. There are sports councils for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in the UK. So that's a UK example, but there is, across the world, a growth in national agencies for sport, and the funding for these national agencies is largely coming from government. So the increasing importance of government in sport, funding sport for all, enabling local authorities in this country through grants to local authorities to be able to manage these sports facilities, and also having an interest and a role in elite national sports policies. So there is, that's when you start to see a real change. Now, in the 1980s and post the 1980s, we've got increasing globalisation of major sport events. So the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics are really seen as a watershed here. The World Cup becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And what you start to have is, as the profile of these sports increases, you've got increasing recognition of top athletes in those sports. So, I was growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, so I can remember, Andre Agassi being, the face of Nike before Michael Jordan. But Michael Jordan was the one who really changed the kind of game for Nike. There are other examples of kind of top athletes being used, but there's a global recognition of top athletes, an increasing kind of cultural phenomenon around these individuals, and the association of these athletes with global brands becomes, and the example par excellence of these is a basketball player who started playing in the mid-1980s in the NBA, Michael Jordan, who's actually got his own kind of line within Nike of Jordan, Air Jordan. And you've got a number of other athletes as well, but Michael Jordan is the example par excellence of this and the original one. There are now many others, but he was the original example. So what are some of the things, or what are some of the characteristics of the global sports market? Well, the real change, step change in this, is the escalation in the price of broadcasting rights for global sports events and for sport generally. So when I first started out in this industry, what I was taught about was local authority sport and government sport, because there wasn't really a large commercial presence. This is the days before satellite TV before the Premier League. The Premier League was created for satellite and cable TV to kind of work in that kind of environment. And, you know, I started in this industry before that. And the focus for us was, as we were taught, was kind of the Sports Council, local authority sport, which is kind of related in the direction I went in the industry into local authority sport, because commercial football and commercial opportunities and the wider kind of supply chain around professional football and suppliers of sport and major sports brands and sports gambling, all these kinds of things didn't really exist. But one of the core changes and the fundamental things, certainly in this country, was the formation of the English Premier League. And globally as well, you've got an escalation in prices for the broadcasting rights for global sports events. One of the other things is the growth of sports brands. Okay, so global marketing of major sports products, so Nike swoosh, you know, Three Stripes, Adidas, these brand images, including people, the faces of athletes, and being closely associated with these brand images and these brand values. So that really changes things as well. And to gain this recognition, these sports brands are willing to pay an awful lot of money. Okay. And linked to this, you've got an escalation in the price of sponsorship deals for both events. So naming rights for events or for sports leagues, and athletes by sport related organisations, so Nike and Adidas sponsoring athletes, and by non-sport, so banking, finance, Coca-Cola, McDonald's sponsoring events or sponsoring kits or sponsoring stands or sponsoring stadia. So that is, you know, that is something. So the exploitation of naming rights and sponsorship is increasingly important in the global sports market and characterises it very much, you know, the ability to get your name out there to a truly global sports market, to raise awareness and to promote your brand globally, and is seen as a very effective use of money by some of these major sports brands. So those are the characteristics of the global sports market. We've traced some of the development of these. That's to kind of lay down something early on in this module. You will come back and look at this in much more detail later on in the module when Daryl takes over, but just so you know what's coming up, we've introduced those to you now, and that is the end of this screencast.